Negation versus Effacement, part of Reconstructing A as A by O.G. Rose. Though similar, a distinction is needed between what leads to sublimation and what leads only to neurosis and cessation. As taught by Dr. Cadell last, Freud warned about falling into the temptation of seeking primordial unity or ultimate wholeness, which is generally a desire to return to the womb and escape the existential and dialectical pressures of everyday life. This is a desire to regain wholeness with the mother, which symbolically relates to a desire to return to Eden, to find happiness in finding the perfect partner or job, to achieve philosophical certainty and an ultimate and stable truth, and so on. The desire for ultimate wholeness and all its problems are discussed extensively throughout the Philosophy of Lack series with Dr. Lass, Tim Adlin, and Alex Ebert, and we have regularly claimed that failing to accept lack and seeking ultimate wholeness is problematic. Wholeness is non-dialectical and idealistic, and we have suggested that it entails a bad death, while at the same time we've stressed the necessary role of death for living the good life. What's going on? The logic all sounds like it's canceling itself out. Philosophy spends a great deal of time defining terms, making fine and yet critical distinctions between negative freedom and positive freedom, to allude to Isaiah Berlin, fairness and equality, and so on. This can sometimes seem pesky and annoying. Socrates was disliked by many, after all. But I think philosophy has done a good job arguing why such distinctions are needed, which problematically only philosophers tend to study. As the Philosophy of Lack series has advanced, it's become increasingly clear to me that distinctions between oneness and harmony are needed, as taken up in the Noumenon frame by O.G. Rose, as is needed a distinction between effacement and negation. It is this later distinction which I would like to focus on here. A main point of the philosophy of lack is that by failing to accept and integrate with lack, we end up effacing ourselves in the name of achieving wholeness. If we integrate with lack, however, we can undergo a negation which could lead to a beneficial sublation. The effort to fill lack that leads to effacement, while the effort to live with lack leads to negation, sublimation, alluding to the difference between solving a problem and managing a problem, as stressed by Johannes. To allude to on A as A by O.G. Rose, to live seeking A as A, or A/A per se, is to live seeking wholeness and effacement, while seeking A is an A, or A/B, is to accept lack, negation, sublation, and so on. Sublation is a Hegelian term which occurs when two entities dialectically relate in a manner that arises to something new, which nevertheless entails the old. Now, as explained in On Hegelian Dialectics, or Non-Discussion Dialectics by O.G. Rose, it is not the case that this sublation is identical with the synthesis, which here would mean that the negation caused by lack is not one that makes the lack vanish, but instead leads to the lack being reincorporated in new and valuable ways. What that exactly looks like is a topic which will take the rest of Reconstructing A as A to explore. The problem with Freudian and problematic ultimate wholeness is that there is a canceling out but not sublation. In a way, we could say that effacement is negation without sublation, a state of ever being canceled out, while negation is an effacement with sublation. The presence of sublation is the key difference between negation and effacement, terms which otherwise are practically similes. Furthermore, we can think of negation as being non-escapist and accepting of the incompleteness of life, a dying to self, while effacement is escapist and denies the incompleteness of life. Alluding to Alex Ebert, we can associate negation with death acceptance and effacement with death avoidance. We want to avoid Freudian dreams of ultimate wholeness, precisely to undergo a negation which leads to sublation, while giving into the temptation of ultimate wholeness leads to an effacement which seems like a negation but ultimately isn't, because no sublation occurs. Moving forward, we can generally associate effacement with something bad, while negation is something good, or at least something necessary. I hesitate to use such moral-sounding terms, but I also think there is a problem if we never use terms like good and bad to designate some situations and circumstances as better than others. It is good to avoid effacement, considering all the neuroses this causes, as discussed throughout psychoanalysis and the Philosophy of Lack series, as it is good to seek integration with lack and the resulting negation sublation. Yes, it's hard to maintain this distinction, seeing as effacement and negation are so similar, but I think it's critical. Negation sublimates, while effacement simply ceases. Ultimate wholeness tricks us into effacement that perhaps we think is a negation, constantly and all the time, a problem worsened by the natural tendencies of our brains. The brain is naturally toward wholeness effacement, which means we must train it to accept lack, negation, sublation. But how do we do that? Will require studying how our brains work, thus the necessity of studying epistemology in our effort to grasp our ontology. The true isn't the rational trilogy as formed accordingly, and this is why we will need to explore the distinction between thinking and perceiving. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, so on, Anchor, and thank you so much for your time.